Tokyo Game Life, a Tokyo-based video game podcast focusing on Nintendo and gaming culture in Japan's capital. Your host Mono here to bring you a slice of gaming life from Tokyo. Today, returning guest Danny Bivens from the Famicast is back to chat about Nintendo 64 in Japan. You might know about its history in the West, but what about the Japanese side? We dig into Japan-only N64 games, the 64DD, exclusive hardware colors, and everything else under the sun as we explore the console's legacy in Japan. Danny also stays on as we chat about The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom 1 year later. Is it still good? Yes, but we get into a lot more than just that. And I take a look at Animal Well, the only Metroidvania I know with a slinky. Let's start with the feature on the Nintendo 64 in Japan with Danny Bivens. Today's feature is about the Nintendo 64 in Japan. Nintendo followed up the incredibly popular Super Famicom with their first ever 3D console, and while you might know the story of how it fared in the West, today we're digging into the Nintendo 64's legacy in Japan. Joining me to chat all about it is a special guest. So guest, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Danny. I'm from a podcast, website, YouTube channel called Famicast. Thanks for having me on today.
Yes, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, man.
Before we get into the unique elements of Nintendo 64 in Japan, I want to know a bit about your N64 history. Were you an N64 kid?
Absolutely. So my brothers and I, we got an N64 for Christmas in 1996. We got Mario, Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wing 64. Before that, like one of my friends, he got it. He must have got it at launch because I remember playing it in like September, October of that year and was being absolutely blown away. You know, being a Nintendo fan anyways, it was just so cool to see Mario in 3D, just everything in 3D. It's just something that just blew my mind.
Yeah, for me, Nintendo 64 wasn't my first console I owned, but that era was when I started to become cognizant of the gaming industry.
Me too.
I started to learn who developers were, when games were coming out. And this is when I really started to read gaming magazines and so forth. Mm-hmm. And this is also when I learned about sales tax because I saved up $150 to buy an N64. But then I realized, oh, there's tax. It's actually more expensive. So I'm like, fortunately, my parents spotted me like that extra $10.
Oh, that's nice.
But ironically, I bought it like in summer of 97.
Okay.
But I didn't own a game until Christmas of 97 because I didn't have any money. I just rented Super Mario 64 over and over again and things like that. But eventually I did own games.
Okay.
So I do have a ton of nostalgia for the Nintendo 64 and I am a fan. So this will not be a N64 hate fest.
No.
But we will get into both the positive and the negative elements of Nintendo 64's lifespan in Japan.
Sure.
Let's start at square one, the launch. Nintendo 64 hit Japanese stores on June 23rd, 1996, so a few months before the US date. Despite launching earlier in Japan, it actually had more launch titles than the US. The States only got Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wing 64, like you said, but Japan got one more game. Danny, do you have any clue on what that third game was?
I think I do. Isn't it Morita Shogi?
You are close. It is a shogi game, but it's Saikyo Habu Shogi.
Oh, God.
which features Yoshiharu Habu on the cover, who was a shogi all-star at the time. And it is actually the first game to use the controller pack. So Is this game in your N64 collection?
I'm going to turn around and look at my shelf. No, it is not. Yeah, that Morita Shogi, one of the other, shogi games of a handful that are out there. That's the only one that I have. And for a different reason, it's a very interesting card. Maybe I'll touch on that in a little bit. But yeah, I don't have this one though.
Yeah, one of the main reasons why I wanted to have you on is that you have a pretty impressive N64 collection. And I really want to dig into, I think, what is a fun element of Nintendo 64's life in Japan. Japan exclusive Nintendo 64 hardware and software. So let's start with the hardware. What would you say are some of the standout Japan-only pieces of N64 hardware?
I think the most obvious one is the Nintendo 64 disk drive, the 64DD. This is something that was going to be, at least at one point, going to be an integral part of the system. And if you don't know, this is a drive that attached to the bottom of the 64. If you look on the bottom of your 64, there's an EXT port that you can open up on most of the 64. Some of the models don't have that port, but a lot of them do. But the idea was this thing connects to it. The carts, at one point they thought the cart size can't get any bigger, so we got to find a way to expand this for cheaper. And not only that, you can have rewritable data and stuff like that on these disks, and just basically more room to put stuff. So Yeah, that's probably the most unique thing that came out here in Japan.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the big one in terms of what's so different about Japanese N64s compared to the Western N64s. It is one of the more interesting pieces of hardware in Nintendo's history in general. And it was actually announced before the N64 came out, but it was frequently delayed.
Yeah.
But Miyamoto and Itoi said that a lot of the plans they had for N64 games were based on the idea that the disc drive would be available day one. Like what you said, whatever couldn't be handled via the cart would be handled with the disc drive. And 60 games were announced, but eventually only 10 were released, with the rest moving to either just a cart or other platforms entirely. I think maybe the most famous example is Dragon Quest VII, which many assumed would come to the DD on its announcement, but instead it hit the PlayStation. So I want to get into some of the N64 DD games. Since you actually own a 64 DD, do you have any game recommendations, or what are some of the standout titles for the DD?
The best thing for the 64 DD is the F-Zero X expansion kit. This game works in, you need to have a copy of F-Zero X, and then you have a copy of this disc. And when they're both plugged into your system, you can have access to a couple of different things. The biggest deal here is that, well, you do get a couple of different courses, and you actually have the ability to create your own courses too. It's a pretty robust editor as well. Like, it was really cool to see that they could do this back in the N64 days. And yeah, it was really fun. Definitely the best part of the N64 DD library. I mean, the only good thing about this is, you know, if you had a GameCube, basically a lot of those features that were in this expansion kit moved over to F-Zero GX on the GameCube, and it looked better too. It
is interesting to see that a lot of the ideas that they had for the DD, it took kind of years for it to be realized. So it was kind of ahead of its time in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I remember just thinking of all the possibilities, like that cart and disc combo thing. That was like one idea of like how they can expand games. You know, other ways they can do it too is just with disc only games. And then other things too, like plugging in Game Boys and stuff like that to the N64 to have some kind of functionality, like that type of stuff. Some of this stuff, like some of this type of functionality is available. Like, for example, and there's the Mario Artist series of games that came out on the system, 4 different games, a Paint Studio, Talent Studio, Polygon Creator, and oh my gosh, but there are 4 of them. And basically the idea here is it's a creative studio type of a thing that you can create a lot of different things. But some of them you can hook up like your digital camera. There's like microphone stuff. You can hook up a Game Boy transfer pack for the 64 and do stuff with the Game Boy camera. Like, there's a lot of really crazy stuff that you could do with some of this stuff if you had all the necessary parts.
Right. The communication kit is the 4th Mario Artist. Not a really catchy name, but
yeah, right.
So yeah, and it comes with a mouse. There's a special Nintendo 64 mouse with the N64 logo on it. Which do you think is better, the Super Famicom mouse or the Nintendo 64 mouse?
I think, well, the N64 mouse is more modern, if you will. I got some good memories with that old Super Nintendo mouse too, so.
Yes. So going back to exclusive hardware, so we talked about the mouse. There are a lot of other things, especially I guess I would say maybe the colors are actually quite unique for Japan. Do you have any favorite Japan exclusive N64 hardware color?
Yeah, I have. It's a 2-tone console. Like the top of it is kind of like a translucent orange, and then the bottom is black. And I believe that's a Dai limited edition or something like that.
Yes.
And I had just picked it up in 2010 at a used shop for like 3,000 yen. So at the time, that was like $30.
Yeah, it looks really awesome. It is like a Halloween-y type of N64 where it is like the classic skeleton orange on the top and on the bottom is just black.
Yeah.
And I hear this being called the Dai Hawks N64 because I think the colors are supposed to be based off the Dai Hawks.
Before the Dai Hawks became the SoftBank Hawks, Dai was their team, and I believe that the colors were, instead of yellow and black, it was orange and black. So, yeah, good call.
Is this a really rare N64? How much would you think it would go for today?
I think it's quite rare now. At the time, I had no idea, obviously. I just picked it up because it was just, I just wanted a 64. I just moved back here to Japan. But I think they're quite pricey these days, especially if you want to get one with a box or something like that. I'm not quite sure how much they go for, probably like $100 or more or something like that. That's just off the top of my head. I was looking at something about that months ago, but it's kind of left me at this point.
Yeah, anecdotally, I did see one in box at Beep in Akihabara, and it was about $300. And this was maybe 2 or so years ago, so I think it's probably even more expensive.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
But I did see on your Twitter, you posted a picture of this, and I thought, whoa, that looks awesome in person. So I'm very jealous of Dia Hawk's N64.
Right place at the right time, man.
Yes. The N64 I have in Japan, I have the gold N64, which I believe in the West, it was only sold in a bundle, maybe with Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, or like Toys R Us exclusive or something like that. But in Japan, you could just buy a gold one. And it looks quite awesome.
Yeah, I've been tempted to buy that one, man. Because, I mean, I had the gold controller in the States. Like, I got it from a friend. That was like a pre-order bonus with, maybe it was Ocarina of Time or something. And I eventually got it from my friend. But I remember seeing pictures of that gold N64. I've never seen one in person, but yeah, it looks super sharp. Oh,
yeah, it definitely is. And I would say, yeah, out of all the Nintendo hardware, there probably is the biggest gap in terms of Japan and the West with the special editions and unique colors of the N64. And actually, ironically, the West did get some things Japan didn't get, which is going to be a trend as we get more into the episode and talk about the software. In terms of colors, Japan did not get a lot of the iconic, fantastic N64s. There's no jungle green, no ice blue, no fire orange, or watermelon red in Japan. It did get some sort of other variations. Like there is a translucent blue N64 in Japan, but the bottom is clear instead of blue. Which is kind of odd that it's like half and half. Japan also did not get the Pokemaniac N64, which was an Australia-only special Pokemon N64, which is quite strange. I never heard about this until I did research for this episode. And also Japan did not get the North American blue Pikachu N64. Japan's blue is slightly lighter, so it is technically different hardware. But if you just saw the blue Japanese N64, you would think, oh, that's the same one as in the West. But they are slightly different shades of blue. And Japan also has an orange Pikachu N64. Do you own any of the Pikachu N64s?
I do not. I think even when I was shopping around for just consoles, like that was a little bit too expensive. I mean, I just got, like I said, I got the Dia Hawks one just on a whim because I just wanted an N64 when I was back here. And then maybe in like 2018, I just wanted a boxed N64. This is a general boxed one. And I found one online for cheap. And just picked it up. But yeah, I was looking at some of the other, these special ones, but it was kind of expensive. And I was like, I just need a basic one. I'll get those other ones later.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a big Pokemon fan, but even the Pikachu N64 is a bit too gaudy for even me. It's hard to describe. It's not so kitschy that it's cool. It just looks like kind of like a Fisher-Price toy.
Yeah.
It's there if you want it.
I think that's the best way to put it.
So let's get into software. While N64 doesn't have a huge library of games, only 198 games came out in Japan. It does have several notable exclusive titles. What are some Japan-only N64 titles that people should check out?
There are quite a few that I really like. I mean, one that some people might not realize is Animal Crossing actually got its start on the N64. And while I think the version that is on the N64, it's a lot less fully featured than the GameCube game, it's still an interesting curiosity just to kind of see where the series came from. Because, like I said, there are some things in that version of the game that are just completely different than in any other version. Like, for example, the wishing well. It's not the wishing well, it's a shrine. There are a lot of really interesting differences between the versions.
Yeah, there are some exclusive items that are only in the N64 version. Like, they never came out to the GameCube edition, and some of the holidays are different. Yeah. And ironically, there's no museum, so Blathers and Co. are not in the game.
Yep, exactly.
Pretty weird to think about. Like, there's an Animal Crossing game without a museum, which is really hard to think about.
So yeah, then that kind of makes you think, like, what am I collecting all this stuff for? But I mean, if you didn't have that frame of reference, it really wouldn't have mattered. But
are there any other titles that stand out for the N64 in Japan?
Yeah, absolutely. Believe it or not, too, some of you guys out there may or may not know this. There's a Dance Dance Revolution game on the N64. There's a dance mat that you can get as well. This is called Dance Dance Revolution Disney Dancing Museum. Yeah, I have this. I found it boxed with the dance mat, relatively cheap. And yeah, it's the song list is kind of not that great. I guess if you're really into Disney, maybe you'll like it. I didn't even recognize like half of the songs, but it was just cool to have a DDR game on the system. And you don't have to play with the dance pad. You can just play with the controller. I just did that. I got out the dance pad and I was like, I don't feel like breaking a sweat. I'm just kind of mashing these buttons here and that'd be a lot easier. But yeah, a couple other games that I'm a big fan of as well. Virtual Pro Wrestling. there are two virtual pro wrestling titles on the N64 that are Japan exclusive. The first one is kind of like a reskin of WCW versus NWO World Tour, which came out everywhere, but it's slightly different. Like they added a couple of different features. Like, for example, in the game after that in the West, WCW NWO Revenge, they added a scoring system and on-screen referees and stuff. They had some of these elements in this Japanese version of the game because it came out in between. It's like a weird in-between release. So it's kind of like an enhanced version of that game, World Tour, essentially. But the second one in that lineup of games, Virtual Pro Wrestling 2, that's considered to be one of the best wrestling games of all time. That's up for debate. Yes. But I mean, gameplay wise, it's absolutely fantastic. If you liked those, grapple based wrestling games from the N64, it's something that you should definitely have on your radar if you don't already own the thing.
For me, in terms of Japan-only N64 games, I always jump to Rakuga Kids, which is a very visually striking 2D fighter from Konami, where all the characters look like kids' drawings.
Right.
Like, it comes from Rakugaki, which is graffiti, but they aren't really graffiti style. They're mostly like crayon kids' drawings. Mm-hmm. This is a title I just really hope that they throw on NSO one day out of the blue, because it is kind of at least worth playing to check out all the really crazy animations. Yeah. And in terms of sheer quality, like you said, I really like Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 from AKI, the developers of No Mercy and all the N64 wrestling games. It is an amazing time capsule of 90s Japanese wrestling. Yeah. And it is like an alternative version of No Mercy. Yeah. So you can kind of think of it like that. And of course, Animal Crossing, which came out only a few months before the GameCube version, is just an enhanced port of the N64 version, but there's a bunch of other stuff added to it. But it is a really fun, it's like a good collector's piece, I think. Even if you don't plan on playing it, it's fun to just put on your shelf. It has a really cool looking box. Yeah. And it's just like, okay, this is where it all began. It's the N64 version. And
if you want to get crazy with the two, because there are actually two variants of the game, one that comes with the memory card and one that doesn't. But yeah, if you want to get crazy with variants, that's where it gets a little bit dangerous. And if you're rich, then hey, go for it, I guess. And Mono, one interesting thing about Rakuga Kids, actually, it did apparently get a release in Europe.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm very US-centric, so I'm thinking, it never came out. Yeah, that's very strange that, why didn't it come out in America then? We're missing out. We didn't get Gururin or Rakuga Kids, or Doshin the Giant.
Yeah.
What's going on? So,
to be fair, Doshin the Giant is not really a good game, so I don't think we're missing out on much.
That's another, just throw it on NSO type of game that I'm really looking forward to. They got to put it up there eventually. They're going to run out of games one day.
Exactly.
So we'll get Rakuga Kids before we know it. There's actually quite a lot of N64 titles that Japan did not get. It didn't get a lot of hardware that America got, but also there are many games that Japan never got. And I think the most notable ones are Pokemon Puzzle League, which was developed by NST, Nintendo Software Technology, but it is based on Intelligent Systems' unreleased Panodopon 64 and Dr. Mario 64, which was developed by Nintendo R&D 1. But that did get a GameCube release. So it is weird that these iconic Nintendo franchises, Mario and Pokemon, did not come out in Japan. Yeah. I don't really know the reasoning. I guess because for for Puzzle League, since it uses a lot of the anime style and it uses a lot of the English voice acting for the anime, maybe there's some licensing thing, or Intelligent Systems was just oh, we don't want to release Panodopon in Japan again or something. But it is strange that there's an American exclusive Pokemon game that a lot of people don't realize. And another big title that never hit Japan, of course, was WWF No Mercy. Right. But they did get, Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. And sadly, Superman 64 never came out in Japan. Do you think Japan missed out by not getting Superman 64?
Absolutely. I mean, the pinnacle of, oh, wait a second. I mean, hey, just for the lulz, I think it would have been great, maybe. So then I can actually go and pick up a copy for really cheap just from the shop or something here. Yeah. But yeah, I've only played that game literally at some game shop about 20 years ago. I'm just glad that's all I played. I still kind of wanted to try it again now to see if it's as bad as I remember.
I do wonder if it came out in Japan, would it be some sort of iconic kusoge, where kusoge, listeners, if you don't know, it just means crappy games. Yeah. And there is a subculture of people who really like these types of games. So I think it would definitely enter the kusoge pantheon if it came out in Japan.
No, absolutely.
And so I want to go back to the disk drive a little bit. We talked about that, there's a lot of problems with it. It was delayed. It didn't come out when it wanted to, and it didn't really live up to its potential. And I want to get into more about the reception of Nintendo 64 in Japan. Of course, Famicom, super popular, Super Famicom, also super popular. Nintendo 64 definitely did not reach the heights of Nintendo's previous two consoles, both in the West, but especially in Japan. Do you think the Nintendo 64 reception in Japan would have been different if the DD came out day one or was bundled with the N64 at launch?
Good question. I mean, I think it would have been, well, with always kind of like the promise of the DD on the horizon, it just kind of like left gamers kind of confused and developers and stuff like that too. Like, well, are we going to do this or not? I think it could have made it a little bit more clear what they're trying to do. But like, I think if they were going to do that, they would have had to like bundle them together. Cause then I think you'd obviously alienate too many people. But at the same time, then it would just shoot up the price of the system. It's interesting. It's like, what would Nintendo be willing to sell this thing for? Would this still be in the realm of what people are willing to pay? In terms of like what it could do, I think it could have been enticing as long as Nintendo explained it well enough and fans knew what it could do. So.
Yeah, it is kind of echoed a little bit with the Kinect that was bundled with the Xbox One.
Right.
And a lot of people did not like that, but I think the disc drive was a bit more integral to the core gameplay experience. But that is a hard proposition for gamers where it's like, okay, you need this extra thing if you want to get the most out of it. Yeah. But we're selling it separately, but maybe we shouldn't sell it separately. So I think it would have been better if it was one device, like not even detachable or anything like that. Just one huge, I guess, like Leviathan of a machine. So I guess we can get into some of the more bummer elements about N64 in Japan. Obviously, not a huge hit. Yeah. It was crushed by PlayStation sales-wise. And even the Saturn outsold N64 in Japan. N64 is at 5.54 million, while Saturn is at 5.7 million. But my excuse is always, the Saturn was on the market for a longer period of time and launched first, but numbers are numbers. Why do you think Japan was not responsive to the N64?
Probably price. Some of the games are probably a lot more expensive. I know some of the retail pricing for like N64 games, but I'm not super familiar with what it was on PlayStation, but I would assume it would probably be quite a bit cheaper price. And then, big companies like Square Enix and not playing ball, with Nintendo that generation. I think that was a big one for Japan.
Yeah, I think the reasons why it didn't hit as big as Japan are pretty similar to the ones about why PlayStation beat it in the West, but maybe the lack of RPGs was far more detrimental in the Japanese market. Do you think if at least Square didn't jump ship, N64 would have been equal to PlayStation, or was it kind of a lost cause from day one?
I think if they had a big supporter like that, with some kind of big franchises, that could have really changed the trajectory of how things would have went. It would have been kind of interesting to see what an N64 developed Final Fantasy VII would have looked like.
Right.
Yeah, wow. That would be really interesting to see some alternate reality of that.
Yeah.
And I really do think that it would have kind of changed things quite a bit. I don't know if Nintendo would have come out on top that generation, but I think they probably would have done a lot better if they had at least like one or two companies to have that kind of support, at least here in Japan.
Ironically, one good, a quote unquote good thing about Nintendo 64 not doing well in Japan is that actually retro game collecting for Nintendo 64 is a bit more accessible than a lot of other consoles. You can easily buy Nintendo 64 games in Japan for like, I think under 1,000 yen. Many titles I see quite cheap. So if you are a Nintendo 64 collector in Japan, I guess that is a silver lining about, it didn't do so well. So there's not a lot of demand for N64 games in Japan. So you can pick them up quite cheap now.
Sure.
But while it wasn't a huge success in Japan, it did have several games that sold well enough, into the millions at least. And I have in front of me the 50 best-selling N64 games in Japan. Danny, any guess on what the best-selling Nintendo 64 game in Japan is?
I'd say off the top of my head, it'd probably be either like Mario 64 or Mario Kart. Like those type of games always seem like they move units. So
it is Mario Kart 64 at 2.24 million copies sold. I think Mario Kart 8 Deluxe sold 2.24 million copies during our talk, but nevertheless, it was the best-selling N64 game. Do you have any other guesses on titles in the top 10? I'll give you a hint. One is Japan exclusive.
Oh, okay. I think I know. So, hold on a second. Would it be the Pokemon Stadium game? Because, like, Mono, as I'm sure you know, and maybe some of you guys out there too, like, there were 3 versions Pokemon Stadium that came out in Japan, one of which did not come out in the West. And it's got to be that one then. It's got to be the first Pokemon Stadium.
The first Pokemon Stadium that is Japan exclusive, because it only had like 60 or so Pokemon in the game, and it wasn't actually that well reviewed, but it did sell like crazy. Yeah. It is the 5th best-selling game in Japan, and the only Japan exclusive title in the top 10. So I can go ahead and read off the top 10 here. So 10, Kirby 64, 9, Mario Party 2, 8, Mario Tennis, 7, Donkey Kong 64, 6, Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver, or 2 in the West, 5, Pokemon Stadium 1, but not R1, which is there too. It's hard to explain, but it's the very, very first Pokemon Stadium that's Japan only. 4, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, 3, Super Mario 64, which I'm a bit surprised. I thought that would be an easy lock for number 1. Number 2, Super Smash Brothers, really high up there. And 1, Mario Kart 64. Now, I told you I have the top 50 games. So, Danny, what do you think is the 50th best-selling N64 game in Japan? I'll give you a hint. It's a Western-developed title, and it is pretty good. At least I think so.
I was going to say Shadows of the Empire, but I'm like, wait a second. That's kind of a good game, but there are some parts of it that are not good.
I think this game is better than Shadows of the Empire, but you are in the neighborhood. I'll give you that hint.
Okay. Star Wars Episode 1 Racer?
Yes. Star Wars Episode 1 Racer.
Wow, okay.
87,000 copies sold is the 50th best-selling Nintendo 64 game. It actually does have kind of a cool cover, the Japanese version, because it has Anakin on it, and then it has like the flags, the pod racers, I guess. Yeah. So it is quite colorful, and it really does stand out. And it is on the Switch, so listeners, if you haven't played it, you can check it out quite easily.
Yes.
Oh, before we wrap up, let's get to talking about box art. Do you have any favorite Japanese box art for the N64?
Yeah, absolutely. The Ocarina of Time box art in Japan, it's really cool. Perfect Dark is also a really cool one too. Like that is like, you know, there's a lady sitting on a sofa and like it's red and black. Like the aesthetic is like really cool. Like Mono just said, the Episode 1 box is pretty interesting too. Yeah, I think those are probably my favorites just off the top of my head. Yeah,
the Perfect Dark box is really awesome. It does look like it's like a film almost.
Yeah, right.
Very artistic. Also, Excitebike also has this really stark red and black cover, which is pretty cool. And yeah, Smash Brothers has the more comic style. I guess the American version also has the same art style,
right?
But it looks more like a comic page, the Japanese version. And also, I guess we didn't mention this, is that one of the key differences between America and Japan, the N64 games, they come in vertical boxes in Japan, like the Super Famicom did, as opposed to the horizontal ones. Do you have a preference? Are you a vertical guy or horizontal guy?
I really don't have a preference with that. I think the better thing about the Japanese box art is that it doesn't seem like Nintendo gave the companies any limits to what they can do. Like all of the box art is pretty open to do whatever they want. Like as opposed to the West, especially in Europe, it's like you got to put it inside of this predetermined area. You have like a space for like 2 screenshots on the back or whatever. But yeah, the Japanese box art is completely up to the publisher, whatever they want to do. So that's why I think we can see so many cool different types of box art. So it was just like almost no limitations on what they could do.
Yeah, and it's not in a frame like the Western box art. It just has a very small N64 logo in the corner. And the rest of the box is just the art, which looks really, really nice. What about the hardware box art? Are you a fan of that style?
I am, because it's quite different than the Western one. Because like what the Japanese one is, it's like a stylized version of the system and kind of like these like purple and blues and stuff like that. And like they, for all of their hardware for the N64, the controllers, controller packs, you know, all that type of stuff, they kind of reuse this aesthetic, kind of like what they do in the West, because it's a picture of the console on the N64 box in the West. It's a picture of the Rumble. It's a picture of the expansion. So they're consistent in like both regions, but I think it's the Japanese side is a little bit more stylistic.
Yeah, it almost looks like a neon kind of image to it, where it's like the background is black, but the outline are these really bright colors. It looks really awesome. And yeah, like you said, it is pretty much the exact same framing of the devices, but it has like a much more artistic look to it. So before we wrap up, what would you say is the legacy of the Nintendo 64 in Japan?
Failure. No, wait a second. No, I mean, I think just like in the West, it's still full of some really great games that a lot of people here did enjoy. But lack of support, lack of RPGs is a big deal of why it did not do well. Yeah, so much time between releases and stuff as well. Yeah, just a lot of missed opportunities. Expensive games could really do it too. So like, I think people do have good memories of it, but just not as much as they do about the PlayStations.
Did you pick up any of the Nintendo 64 merch that was released by Nintendo Tokyo?
Oh yeah, you bet I did. I got a couple of mugs. I got some stickers I'm not going to use. They're put away safely. Did you get the controller coaster? No, I didn't. But I got a T-shirt that has just like the N64 Japanese box art on it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I was like, hey, cool, let's do this. So, yeah. How about you, man? Did you pick up any of that stuff?
I have a mug. That's the number one thing I wanted. My wife keeps getting on to me about having too many mugs, but that is like a really easy, because I have so much stuff that I don't need at all. So I try to be as practical as I can. Sure. So I'm like, well, a mug, you need to drink, don't you?
Right.
But now I have like 2 Pokemon mugs and 2 Kirby mugs and like N64 mug, and it's getting, I don't drink that much. I don't use like that many mugs, but it is a fun thing to buy.
I was going to say, I was going to use the excuse you're thirsty, but I guess we can't do that.
All right. Well, that was our look at Nintendo 64's impact on the Japanese gaming world. Some good, some bad, but the N64 lives on in all of our hearts and, of course, on Nintendo Switch Online. Now, Danny, you're going to stay with me as we chat about the 1-year anniversary of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. All right, this episode's game section is dedicated to celebrating, critiquing, analyzing, discussing, whatever you want to say about the 1-year anniversary of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. The hype has died down, the dust has settled, so let's take a look at one of the biggest Nintendo releases ever now that it has been in our hands for a full year. So Danny, what were your immediate impressions of Tears of the Kingdom when you rolled credits?
Wow, I think was the first thing I thought. I didn't come close to like 100%ing the game, but just everything about the story, and I spent like 130 hours or something like that with the game. I mean, you know, as you know, man, like the older we get, more responsibilities and stuff, it's harder to spend that kind of time with the game. So like anytime I spend that much time with the game and you finally see, you know, those credits, it's kind of like a weird feeling. I really love the game. That's why I played it as long as I did. Yeah, it was pretty satisfying.
Do you still feel the same way today, or are you a bit more critical of the game, or maybe even your appreciation of the game has grown? Or how would you describe your feelings on Tears of the Kingdom 1 year later?
I think having some time to step back, that can be good. For games, you can kind of reset what was kind of brought on by just the hype. But I think even stepping back and thinking about it right now, yeah, I still think it is a really super solid entry into the Zelda franchise, and pretty amazing follow-up to something like Breath of the Wild, which had already knocked it out of the park with being so good. And then for Nintendo to come back and make something that is even better, like, I couldn't believe that they could do it, and they did it. So like, that's kind of like where I'm at now. I still believe that it's a fantastic game. I don't think my opinion has really changed too much.
Yeah, I've actually been playing it recently. I cleaned up some things I didn't do when I put the game down last year. I finally did some of those Colosseums, and I got the Royal Guard glider. And it does take a second to remember what button does what.
Sure.
But I just love being immersed in that world. And I think like you, I was a little skeptical about the game when it came out, because I thought there's no way it's going to touch Breath of the Wild. But to me, it definitely has surpassed it. What about you, Danny? Would you rank Tears over Breath of the Wild?
I think so. It's just, it basically is Breath of the Wild and then some. So like, just with that alone, I think that's something.
It is like a very bold decision to take the same world and just build upon it. I think maybe it sounds weird, but it would be easier to just kind of like, okay, let's just make a new world and let's do the same thing again. But to be forced to use what you've already built and use it in a different way, I think is a lot more challenging.
I mean, it's even different than, you know, back to the N64 talk. It's different than what you would have found with the jump from Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask. They use a similar, if not identical, engine, but the world that is in Majora's Mask versus the world that is in Ocarina of Time is different. You know, Termania versus Hyrule. You could at least freshen things up for gamers so they won't maybe potentially complain and be like, this is the same as before. Because you could make that argument about Tears of the Kingdom. I think it's a ridiculous argument to make because there's so much more to it. But yeah, it would have probably been easier for Nintendo to do something brand new, but pretty cool of them just to stick with this and then find ways to make it different.
Yeah, I definitely get some of the criticisms about that. Obviously, everything was completely new in Breath of the Wild, even the smallest details about what button does what, how you control Link. Every single gameplay mechanic was brand new. But in Tears of the Kingdom, many gameplay mechanics from Breath of the Wild move over. And small things like the Lizalfos being essentially chameleons. When I first saw that in Breath of the Wild, it really blew my mind. I thought, oh, wow, that's such an interesting take on this enemy. But in Tears of the Kingdom, they're just the Lizalfos again. Do you think Tears was hurt at all by reusing a lot of the elements from the first game?
I don't think so. I think it kind of gave Nintendo a little bit more time to work on their engine too. So I mean, yeah, there are some issues with the game, performance wise and stuff like that. That happens with aging hardware. But considering the scope of Tears of the Kingdom, I'm still impressed with what they were able to do. I think it's a kind of game that it's not going for like photorealism. So I think with that type of stuff, that type of style, it's a lot easier to go back to over time. It's something that'll hold up over time as opposed to something that's trying to look like super realistic.
Yeah, and I think the idea of let's take the same game world and just add new mechanics onto it, it is a very Nintendo-esque philosophy. The predictable thing is like, okay, let's make another Breath of the Wild-esque world. It doesn't take place in Hyrule, and it's just like a new world and the same kind of gameplay concepts that are there. But here they really focused on, it's okay to reuse some elements like the same enemies and a lot of the same landscape, but the way you're going to interact with it is totally different. That is kind of Nintendo's philosophy for their hardware, if you think about it. The Switch is, their big hook is not, oh, look at the power. It's how can you interact with games in a new way? And Tears of the Kingdom is like, that's the same philosophy. You have the same world, but you're going to interact with it in completely new ways. So what are your overall thoughts on the new powers like Ultra Hand and Ascension? Were they used to their maximum potential?
Honestly, before the game came out, I remember seeing some of the trailers where you first start seeing these powers. I remember especially there was like a breakdown where Aonuma was breaking down like building things and stuff. And at that point, I was not impressed. I was actually kind of like disappointed and thought, I think I'm going to hate this. Giving it a chance, there are a lot of cool things that you can do. I think building is probably my least favorite thing to do. I mean, Ascension can be a really cool one. And you can actually use it in a lot of different situations. Like, for example, there was one time I was flying in like a shrine. I had to fly some kind of a device towards this, platform. And I missed a platform. But then I thought in my head, it's like, hey, I'm going under the platform. I get to choose Ascension and then just go right there and still be fine. So there are some ways for you to make use of some of these powers. And I mean, even with the building and stuff like that too, even if you're an idiot when it comes to that stuff like myself, you still can figure out puzzles by just brute forcing things sometimes. Like, they want you to make a boat. It's like, I'm just going to make a bridge instead or something like that. But yeah, overall, I do like the powers. And like you said, it really kind of shows that Nintendo wasn't just making something that is exactly the same gameplay wise and just changing the story a little bit. Like, no, they literally changed how the game plays in these very specific ways. And I think that they're pretty fun.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the new powers. I do miss some of the older ones, like the stasis. That was just so useful in battle. But there's much more gameplay variety and things you can do. And Ultra Hand especially. First of all, I just love the name Ultra Hand because it is such a callback to their original toy. Only Nintendo can do this because they've been in business so long. They can do just fun throwbacks like this.
Right.
And yeah, Ultra Hand, I think a lot of the genius of Ultra Hand is not solely on how it works. Obviously, it works really well and it's very intuitive about how you can just put things together. If you think about how many things do I need to stick together to solve a puzzle, the maximum amount of items is probably 3. So you don't need to get super complicated. Right. So for those who are thinking like, oh, I'm not creative, I can't build a Fortnite level house or something in Tears of the Kingdom, you really don't need to because a lot of the puzzles can be done with just like, here's part A, part B, part C, stick them together and you're done. But if you want to put part D, E, F, G, etc., you can go ahead and do that.
Right.
So I think a lot of the genius is that it's so flexible, but the game is not so increasingly difficult where you need to have like some sort of 12 build combo that you need to master in order to get the most out of it. And
dude, like you said, with Addison things, holding up the signs and stuff like that, like sometimes when you figure it out, even if it looks like absolute trash, you're like, man, I'm a genius.
Exactly.
If you looked at my screenshot or video clip or something, you'd be like, wow, this guy's an idiot, but he still got it. And I think that's the thing about, like, especially with the building. It's like, there are a lot of different ways that you can go about stuff, and none of it's wrong. It's just a matter of, like, can you do it? Can you clear, like, what they're trying to get you to go through? And that's fun. And like I said, again, you feel a sense of accomplishment after doing that too.
Yeah. And the fuse, I think fuse was a really good counterpoint to a lot of people's complaints about the weapons breaking, because it was such a good idea about, okay, if weapons break, you can just kind of forge a new weapon together. And there's so many different combinations you can make. A lot of really fun, silly ones, like the mushroom can bounce enemies away. I didn't really feel like I was running out of weapons compared to Breath of the Wild. I'm not a weapon durability hater. I thought it worked really well in Breath of the Wild, but I think, okay, it works even better in Tears of the Kingdom. And a lot of the weapons you make are really cool looking. The Zonai weapons, they look awesome with like the green and the gold. So it's really fun to make those. And auto build, which is really a godsend. That really helps with a lot of the traversal, or you don't have to like make everything from scratch. So that's also a really great idea. Did you make the hover bike?
I didn't have the patience to do it.
Oh, really?
Like, and how I traverse the game too is usually just get to a high point and just jump and parasail or use the horse. But most of it was just parasailing. And I realized, especially after talking to friends, like, I'm about like, at that point, I was like 100 hours in, and one of my friends is like, hey, why don't you make the hover bike? It's like, well, I'm like, I wasn't anywhere close to done, like, as I'm like 100% in the game. I was thinking like, man, I gotta like move on.
Yeah, the hover bike, super, super useful. I really only used it for the depths because, of course, it's dark and you can't see anything. So just like flying from the light routes, that was how I navigated the depths. I didn't really use it so much on the ground or the air. I just think there's an advantage to being on the physical ground.
Right.
And I think because I played so much Breath of the Wild, so there's a lot of times where I'm still like climbing up the mountain and like trying to think about, okay, where can I get my footing? But then I realized, I could just kind of fly up here, can't I? But old habits kind of die hard.
Sure.
But I do like the hover bike for like the depths exploration. And the sky, I guess depending on your battery, the hover bike, it won't get you as far as you think it can. So I never thought it was like a broken mechanic. It is really useful in this one specific area. But otherwise, it's still a lot of freedom in terms of what you can build and what you can make. All right, the story, it has one. Did the plot of Tears of the Kingdom meet your expectations after Breath of the Wild?
I think so. I mean, with Zelda games, I think the whole point of a Zelda game isn't necessarily the story. That's mainly the gameplay. I think that's what people should go in playing a Zelda game for. Even with that said, I did think that the story here was fine. It's not like groundbreaking or anything like that, but there were some pretty cool elements to it that some kind of things were kind of shocking that happened throughout. But I was overall satisfied. My expectations were pretty low, so.
Yeah, I quite like the premise where, I guess, quote unquote spoilers, if you haven't played this game after 1 year, turn off the podcast and go play it right now. But some spoilers, I did like the time travel element where Zelda fulfills her own destiny. I was kind of blown away that they did emphasize the Zonai, which in terms of the Zelda fandom or Zelda theorist, the Zonai mentions in Breath of the Wild, that was the thing a lot of people hooked onto. And if you just type in Zonai in YouTube, there's just hour-long videos of Zonai breakdowns and explanations and whatnot. But they really went all in on the Zonai in this game. You see the Zonai, you learn a lot more about their customs and their culture and history. So I was pretty shocked that they focused on them at all. But again, there's still so many questions you have about them because there's only 2 of them. Like, what happened to them? And also, when you go into the depths, you have even more questions about, okay, who built this? How, when, where, why?
Right.
So there's definitely a lot of mysteries that are not solved. So I think maybe some people might be frustrated with that, but I think that's also the point where they don't want to give you all the answers.
Sure.
What do you think about, I guess, as a continuation from Breath of the Wild, do you think it was a good idea to kind of maybe have a hard cut from the story events of Breath of the Wild, or do you think they could have built upon it more?
I mean, they probably could have. It's probably smarter to do what they did, honestly.
Yeah, Tears of the Kingdom is almost sort of an alternate telling of Breath of the Wild, if you think about it. A lot of the elements are the same in terms of there's an ancient evil, there's a bunch of goop everywhere, which, again, the goop is differently named compared to the previous goop. There is a different gameplay mechanic, but it is weird that nobody said, hey, this is like the goop from years ago. Isn't that weird? And also, nobody really made a big, strong connection between Calamity Ganon and Ganondorf. Zelda says this is a weird name once.
Yeah.
There's no stronger connection there. They made it so you don't need to play Breath of the Wild to understand the story.
Yeah.
But if you did, it is kind of weird that they kind of just dropped everything from Breath of the Wild and are sort of retelling the same type of story.
Sure.
Which is new characters and whatnot.
And then, like you said, too, because it's harder and harder to, maybe as a game company, to expect someone to have played something in your library, especially, at that point it had been 6 years, right? Yeah. I mean, elementary school kids go from being a little kid to like almost being in junior high school or something. So it's smart of them to make something open enough where you don't have to worry about knowing what happened in the past game. It kind of sucks for more hardcore fans that want to have some kind of interconnected story, though.
Yeah, I think that's a big criticism about a lot of the hardcore fans is that, okay, well, a lot of the questions from Breath of the Wild were not answered, like what happened to all the Sheikah technology and whatnot. But I do understand that Nintendo is trying to pitch this to brand new people.
Sure.
And there are some references, of course, to what happened in Breath of the Wild, but they're not as strong as maybe they could be. But I do understand they wanted to start from scratch in some way. Even I go back to Sega, they did change Kiryu as the protagonist in the Yakuza games because there were just so many, I guess now, Like a Dragon games where they're like, okay, people can't jump into the 5 or 6. We need to make a hard cut and give it a new protagonist. So I do understand that thinking. And is there any element of Tears of the Kingdom that you think is underappreciated or something the game does that people don't give it enough credit for?
Very good question. Yeah, I mean, I would say the depths or something like that, the Sky Islands. It does seem to me like a lot of people, I think people generally kind of enjoy or maybe are afraid of the depths, which is fine. I am too. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about the Sky Islands. I thought it was kind of an interesting place in the game. It's quite bare compared to the regular ground and maybe compared to the depths with like things that are out there. But I think there's some really interesting things that can be found in the sky. I think maybe that's a little bit underappreciated. I don't know. That's kind of what it seems like to me. Is it the best part of the game? No. But it seems like it's something that a lot of people overlook.
Yeah, I am a big fan of the Sky Islands as well because there are 3 different sort of gameplay loops that all sort of, again, tie together. The Sky Islands, they're mostly focused on puzzles compared to the other parts. So you're thinking about, okay, there's puzzles on each individual island, but also navigating from one island to the next, also kind of a puzzle within itself. Because you have to think about what you need to build, how you need to go there. The ground, of course, is more for adventuring and questing, and the depths are for kind of more challenging gameplay elements and also farming materials. They're all tied together. For example, like the sky, you collect the sunbloom or the items, and you collect the Zonai devices to help you build things. And then on the ground, you can find the things that make you light up the depths. And then you can use your Zonite devices on the ground to help you. And then when you get to the depths, you find Zonite, which helps you upgrade your battery, which helps you build better and bigger devices, which again, you can use in the depths. So they all kind of blend in together. You constantly need to go back and forth to get the most out of the experience and to quote unquote level up Link to his maximum potential. So I thought it was really creative about how they did that. And yeah, I really love the Sky Islands. I love the aesthetic. As you know, Danny, the ginkgo trees in Japan in fall, the yellow leaf trees. I think that's such a really striking look to have. And I love the music on the Sky Islands. And just like the idea that if you want to go from island A to island B, if you fall, that's it. You fell. So you got to really think about it. I do like that consequence of course, the shrine's up there so you can warp to there. But there are some spots where it's like, you better nail this or you're done.
It's like, I'm trying to go to a shrine and I literally just fell off onto the, oh my God. I've had stuff like that happen. It can be kind of frustrating, but still fun at the same time.
Yeah, and I thought a lot of the puzzles were really creative about how they work. And there's so many just crazy things you can find in the sky. I always go back to like the big ball puzzles. Yeah. Those are just like, what's in there? What is that? And when you go inside, it's like this really unique, fun puzzle that you can do. A lot of the puzzles are so huge in scope. I remember one of the ball puzzles. You got to launch something out of the ball onto the island. And you're just like, I really hope I line this up correctly. Otherwise, this crystal is just going to plummet to the depths of the earth. But it is really satisfying when you nail it. So yeah, I'm a big Sky Island fan. It looks so beautiful when you see like the sunset and everything. And going back to another underappreciated element of the game it's really amazing how it runs on the Switch.
Hmm.
This, in terms of the square footage, I kind of wonder, is this the biggest open world game ever? Maybe like Minecraft, it's technically bigger, like a proc gen map is like technically bigger in terms of square footage, but in terms of something that's handcrafted, I think this has got to be number one. And this is running on a Switch, which is like iPhone 12 level hardware. So, and I recently played Baldur's Gate 3, which is not an open world game, but it is a huge, epic, sprawling game. And this is a great game, but there's a lot of bugs in there. There's quests that are broken. There's glitches. There's mechanics or abilities that don't work. But in Tears of the Kingdom, I haven't had any glitches or any game-breaking things or anything that impeded my gameplay, even though there's so many crazy physics, mechanics, ideas all jammed together in this game.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I will say sometimes there are some like hiccups depending on where you go, unlike the game world, but it's nothing like you see in a lot of other open world games where things are just like completely broken. I mean, Nintendo, it's just a little bit different whenever they make games, especially like on this scale. It seems like there haven't been, I can't think of any like huge games like this that they've made that have had any like big swings and misses or some kind of like game breaking bugs. I mean, they're usually pretty good about making sure that type of stuff doesn't ship with their big games. There's probably some exceptions to this, but I think generally speaking, yeah. It's crazy to think how big this freaking world is and then just how smoothly you can go within it and not have something be broken. It's pretty crazy to think about.
Nintendo has been putting the game back to the spotlight recently with merch collabs in Japan. Have you had a chance to check out the new merch at Nintendo Tokyo or the shirts at Uniqlo?
I was at Nintendo Osaka last week, actually. I hadn't been to Osaka in like 10 years. So that was a fun trip. Went to Universal Studios Japan, Super Nintendo World, and Nintendo Osaka. My wife was kind enough to let me snoop around in there for a little bit. And yeah, I did see a lot of the Zelda stuff there. Well, all of it. Some of it I didn't realize was new. I just remember thinking like, wow, I haven't seen this. But yeah, I have not made it to Uniqlo for the Tears of the Kingdom shirts yet. I do want to get at least like one of those, so we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, they pretty much shadow dropped new merch. Nintendo Tokyo and Osaka and Kyoto, there's now a bunch of new Tears of the Kingdom merch and it's on sale right now. And I'm like, whoa. And it was announced Friday and I went Saturday to Nintendo Tokyo. And yeah, they have all that stuff laid out there. I think the coolest thing is the glider rug. I wanted to buy this, but my wife said don't buy it, so I didn't. But I did pick up a shirt, like the button-up shirt, which is really cool because it has like the geoglyph patterns on it. It's like subtle, but also if you know, you know. So
the black one?
Like that. Yeah, the black one.
Gotcha. Yeah, I saw that.
I got one of the secret stones. It's like a pin badge. It's a blind box.
Yeah.
I got the wind secret stone, which is probably the most useful one out of all the ones in the game.
Yeah.
And yeah, I went to Uniqlo as well. I got two new shirts. So it is really fun to see that Nintendo is, for their 1 year anniversary, it's just like, remember Tears of the Kingdom? Here's a bunch of stuff. And now that people have played it, you can get into more really fun spoilery types of things where, yeah, they're selling the secret stones. They're selling a keychain of the pillar or the sign that Addison is holding. Yeah, other cool things like that. These are real deep cuts into the world of Tears of the Kingdom. What do you think the game's legacy is going to be, say, 10 years from now?
Well, I think visually speaking, it's still going to hold up. It's not a realistic style, so I think that type of thing will hold up. I think it'll also hold up because of just the scale of what it's trying to do. Not just necessarily the world, but even this is stuff with the physics, with all the powers and like all that type of stuff. It's not something that a lot of developers try, and it seems like Nintendo went out on a whim and tried it, and it worked. And it was still fun to play. I think this is going to be something that's going to be looked back on fondly.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it will even be more unique as time passes because unlike Breath of the Wild, I don't see a whole lot of people copying the mechanics of Tears of the Kingdom in their game. Is Ubisoft going to put Ultra Hand in the next Assassin's Creed or whatever? I don't think so.
Right.
That seems like such a hard thing to implement. So I think a lot of developers would be like, let's just not put that in there. Or even something like Ascension. Think of all the debug work that went into making sure Ascension worked. Yeah. So I think a lot of the mechanics will be very singular compared to games 10 years from now. There'll be things you can do in Tears of the Kingdom now that you can't do in other games years and years from now. So I think the legacy of Tears of the Kingdom will be more and more positive as time passes on. Because like Breath of the Wild, there have been Breath of the Wild clones, but nobody did it as well. And it really did open up a new kind of gameplay philosophy in terms of what you can do in open world games. It has been copied and built upon since then. Tears of the Kingdom, it's hard to build upon it, but I think it will be very unique years from now. So, Danny, final question. How on earth are they going to top this game with the next Zelda title?
Oh my God. Yeah, that's always the question. That was the same question with Breath of the Wild, right? Like, how are they going to top this? And then they did it. But yeah, it's going to be crazy to think about, man, because, obviously the next Zelda is likely going to be on the next iteration of the Switch.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, obviously one thing they could do is, if it's a resolution bump, 4K, but like, that's not exciting. I mean, yeah, It's great to have a higher resolution, better graphics and all that type of stuff. But like, if they go back to just a higher visual fidelity, but like less gameplay, it's going to be tough to top this one, man. I really don't know what they could do, but I think there's enough crazy people at Nintendo that have a lot of interesting ideas that if any developer on the planet can do it, it's definitely them.
Yeah, I remember in a Famitsu interview with, I think, Aonuma and Fujibayashi, the director, the interviewer did say, where do you go from here? And they're like, oh, don't worry, we have a ton of ideas about Zelda. I'm like, whoa, that's a very bold thing to say after you just put out Tears of the Kingdom.
Right.
And I remember when Breath of the Wild came out, I was thinking about what they could do for a sequel. I was thinking, they should put like caves in the next Zelda game. That would be really fun to have the open world game with caves. Well, and not only did they do that, they went far, far beyond just caves.
You nailed it. Depths, caves, same thing.
Yeah. It's like, 100 something caves in the game. That's not even counting the depths and the wells. I love the wells. That's such a, you don't need to put that in the game at all, but they just did it. And there's 60 of them. They're all fun to go through. I'm very small brained compared to the geniuses at Nintendo. I would have been happy with just here's Breath of the Wild with caves, but they went far, far beyond that. Well, those are our thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom 1 year later. Listeners, if you haven't played it yet, check it out. I promise it's still worth playing. So, Danny, thank you so much for joining me for not just one, but 2 whole segments. Where can people find you?
So you can find me a couple of different places. If you want to follow me and personally, like individually, you can follow me at DannyBiv, DANNYBIV. That's both on Twitter and Blue Sky. I'm also editor and host of a podcast in Japan here called the Famicast. You can find us at thefamicast.com. That's then Famicast, FAMICAST.com. You can find us on YouTube also, the same on Twitter and Blue Sky. And I think that about covers it for me. Oh, and, maybe I didn't mention this. Gosh, I can't even remember, but I've written a piece for a book called Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the N64 Library. I wrote a piece about the 64DD there. This book isn't out yet. It's coming out soon. If you're interested in that type of stuff, like, hey, check it out. If not, hey, it's cool.
Yeah, definitely. Famicast is my go-to if I want to check out the new updates on Power Pros and what's happening there. So I really appreciate you putting forth the effort there.
Yeah, we got you covered there.
So the links to everything will be in the podcast description. So listeners, check it out. Danny Bivens, once again, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, man.
I do have one more game to talk about, Animal Well from Billy Basso. Though the publisher is the one who's been getting most of the press, it's the first game from Video Game Donkey's publishing company, Big Mode. If you don't know who Donkey is, he's quite a famous YouTuber, and a lot of people were skeptical when Donkey started his publishing company, especially since he kind of pitched it as, hey, just tell me your game and I might help you make it. But obviously, it was much, much smarter to just push a game that was close to being done. So Animal Well came out, got rave reviews, and I decided to pick it up since people were saying it's an early Game of the Year contender and one of the best Metroidvanias ever. I rolled credits, and while I'm not quite convinced it's in the upper pantheon of Metroidvanias, it is a very good game with a lot of clever puzzles and fun items. The premise is as simple as can be. You're a little Kirby-looking guy, and you're apparently in some sort of well with animals. In pure Metroidvania fashion, you explore one huge map, find items to help you solve puzzles, and then traverse said map, and have a couple of battles along the way. What sets Animal Well apart from a lot of other Metroidvanias is that it's not combat-focused at all. There are enemies, but you get rid of them by either running away or distracting them. There are certainly some intense encounters, including a few chase segments, but you're likely not going to be resetting over and over again because you can't get past some enemy. In lieu of combat, there are dozens and dozens of puzzles. Many of the puzzles are mechanically simple, like just pressing a button to unlock a door, or hitting switches or racing platforms, but they will absolutely force you to think carefully about the layout of the area and your moveset. I'm quite impressed that the game really just has a handful of puzzle types, but manages to integrate the map layout into the puzzle so well that it never feels like you're repeating puzzles or just hitting things mindlessly. It's a Metroidvania, so yes, some puzzles can't be solved without getting the appropriate item. There isn't a Tears of the Kingdom level of freedom here. There's one solution and you just do it. But the items do have a little bit of freedom in how you use them, and all of the ones in the game are very fun to use and are very clever conceptually. They are a bit freeform in their use as well. Many are directional or let you use them in multiple ways. There are some secret items too, some you might not come across in your playthrough, or some that are exclusive to the postgame. But all the ones I got my hand on nailed the feeling of being confused once you got it, but then being amazed once you started using it. The game also has a good mix of puzzles that force you to use multiple items. It's often not apparent what item you need to use to solve certain puzzles, and you're constantly learning what each item can and cannot do. Animal Well lets you experiment with them in creative ways, and you can see the breadth of each item when you're solving the often head-scratching puzzles. I really enjoyed the emphasis on puzzles over the combat. One reason I don't really gel with a lot of the Vania part of Metroidvania is that the combat can be a little clunky or frustrating, especially when you think about stats and weaknesses and whatnot. One Metroidvania I think is super underrated is the Strider reboot from about a decade or so ago, because it was so focused on speed and pretty much every enemy died in just one hit. Animal Well says, let's just excise all combat together and focus on brain twisters and some light twitch platforming. Nothing too crazy in terms of needing good reflexes, but there are several puzzles where you need to hit a switch, then quickly move to another part of the area and do something else. Oh, and I haven't even mentioned this yet, but one of the standout elements of the game is the evocative and moody art style. Since the game takes place in a well, many areas are quite dark, but they're often illuminated by neon plants or other objects in the background. The contrast between the often black backgrounds and the bright objects on the screen sets a really unique mood. It also has a pixel art style that can be incredibly detailed or minimalistic depending on what it portrays. The soundtrack is equally as atmospheric, along with some intense tunes during some of the more frightening moments of the game. It's not a horror game, but there is a mysterious and kind of oppressive atmosphere throughout your adventure. If I had to throw out some criticisms, there are a few chase sequences in the game where a big monster is after you and you need to go to a particular part of the map or solve some puzzle. These are frustrating, I can't lie. I don't think how you beat these segments is particularly interesting either. You really just keep doing what you've been doing, but now there's something that could easily kill you. The penalty for death isn't really anything though, you just warp back to the last save point. And the game is quite generous in having some puzzles register as being complete even if you die after finishing them, but before saving. So except for a few very rare instances, you won't be needing to redo puzzles you've already completed. Also, I suppose this is not a criticism of the game, but instead of one about hype, I do think it's a very good game. But the way some people have been talking about it makes me wonder if we've been playing the same game. So many people are saying, go into it completely blind, don't look up anything, which I really don't get. It is a fairly standard Metroidvania in terms of the flow of the game. It doesn't really have a major twist on the conventions or suddenly reframes what you're doing. Now, the game does have some ARG elements and meta elements, which is what the postgame seems to focus on. For me, I'm not really into those types of things. Yes, I am aware that the background of this part of the map actually has a secret Morse code that you can deduce or whatever, but I rolled credits, had a good time, and I'm done with the game. It takes about 7-ish hours to roll credits, which is pretty standard Metroidvania length. The ARG is there if you really want it though. Another big part of the postgame is collecting eggs, which are hidden throughout the game. They are worth getting, especially since a certain number of them are tied to optional items, but I never felt the impetus to get all the eggs. That's just me though. I can maybe see some people rolling credits and then thinking, I gotta dig into every little secret this game is hiding. But if you're not into that at all, Animal Well is still a very good Metroidvania with a stellar art style, a focus on smart puzzles, and it's filled with cool items to play around with. Can't say you'll be disappointed if you're into the genre. And if you're not that into the genre, you might like this one more than the others due to the de-emphasis on the combat. And there's a bunch of meta ARG stuff there if that's your jam. Does it reveal that the main character is actually related to Kirby? If so, maybe I should get into it then. That's it for games. Now for some news. I think it would be easier to talk about what didn't happen these past 2 weeks, but clearly the biggest news item of the week, the month, the year, maybe the decade for Nintendo fans is that Nintendo has finally confirmed information about a successor to the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo President Shuntaro Furukawa jumped on Twitter to tweet out the following. This is Furukawa, President of Nintendo. We will make an announcement about the successor to the Nintendo Switch within this fiscal year. It will have been over 9 years since we announced the existence of Nintendo Switch back in March 2015. We will be holding a Nintendo Direct this June regarding the Nintendo Switch software lineup for the later half of 2024, but please be aware that there will be no mention of the Nintendo Switch successor during this presentation. A lot to pull from this. For one, as stated here and clarified by the Q&A, Nintendo is going with the phrase successor to Nintendo Switch to describe the new system. All the rumors and links point to this thing being nearly the exact same form factor as the existing Switch, so calling it a successor makes a lot of sense. Before Switch was revealed, Nintendo described it as a new hardware with a brand new concept, and going even further back, Wii U was described as a system to succeed Wii. So the terminology is definitely closer to the Wii U than the Switch, which is a little concerning if you just compare it like that. But even then, Wii U wasn't just a straight power upgrade to the Wii, which is what many assume the Switch 2 is going to be. I am still wondering if Switch 2 will have any notable hook or immediate thing you see that makes you realize, hey, this is markedly different from the Switch. Nintendo has a very tough hill to climb in differentiating Switch 2 from the original and also convincing casual gamers to make the leap to the new hardware. But then again, Sony hasn't had any trouble convincing people to jump from PS4 to PS5 despite some thin early years when it came to the software. But then again, part 2, a lot of people come to PlayStation for the power, so they expect and want a straight power upgrade, while I think people want Nintendo to innovate a bit more when it comes to how you experience the games. But then again, part 3, I think consumers, especially casual gamers, are a bit more adept in understanding the need to upgrade hardware. When Wii U came out, we were on, the iPhone 5? I think at that time, many smartphone users probably had just bought one smartphone ever in their entire life. My first was iPhone 4, and it took a few years before I realized, okay, every X years I need to replace it. Maybe I am overthinking it, and the question of, I already have a Switch, why do I need a new one, is not that prevalent among casual gamers. Another point of interest is that Furukawa states that it will be announced this fiscal year, emphasis on the fiscal part of that sentence. This means the announcement is anywhere from 2 seconds from now to March 31st, 2025. So no guarantee it will be this year, but if it is a holiday 2025 item, a March 2025 announcement isn't out of the question. But if they want to launch it like the Switch in early March, it would have to be announced later this year with a launch early next year. So we are going to be playing the waiting game for a few months, and they specifically said that the June Direct, which, hey, was also announced in this, won't have any Switch 2 info. This is all tied in with their latest financial report, so let's get into that. Switch has now sold 141 million units worldwide, and they expect to sell 13.5 million this fiscal year. This is pretty lofty considering they sold about 15 million last fiscal year, so this year's drop isn't expected to be significant. Now, I'm not sure if you remember what last year had, but it had a brand new Zelda game, Pikmin 4, a brand new 2D Mario, and Nintendo in general was boosted thanks to the Mario movie. So they had the perfect hand to play with. But this year, the first half titles have been very niche or spin-offs. I have heard people theorize a price cut, but I think that's a stretch. They've gone so long without one, and when Switch 2 comes out, having such a huge price disparity between 1 and 2 might be a little off-putting. I do wonder what they could possibly have for 2024 that moves hardware. A new Mario Party game is rumored, which will sell well, but I don't think people will buy a Switch for it. Prime 4, again, this is not a huge system seller. The biggest game on the horizon is Pokemon Legends ZA, but that will launch Q1 2025 at the earliest. If they really want to wrangle up some casual gamers who haven't jumped on the Switch yet, maybe a brand new Tomodachi Life with the emphasis of, hey, this is kind of like Animal Crossing, could be a big hit. For games that did come out, Mario vs. DK sold 1.12 million, with Princess Peach Showtime hitting 1.22 million. That last number is especially impressive considering it was only out for about a week before the financial quarter wrapped up. If it can leg its way to 2, or dare I say 3 million, safe to say that it's a big hit for Goodfeel. On Pikmin Watch, Pikmin 4 has sold 3.48 million, which is great, but I am still hoping it can leg it out to 5 million. 4 million seems pretty safe, but 5 would bring it to the next level. It has been selling incredibly well in Japan, so like Splatoon, it might just be one of those franchises that is very Japan-centric. But I think for the next Pikmin and Splatoon game, they might want to make a big swing to make it more popular overseas. Tears of the Kingdom is at 20.61 million, and its likes haven't been that great compared to Breath of the Wild. Just this past quarter, Tears sold 330k, but Breath of the Wild sold 240k. That's pretty absurd considering you'd think that a lot of people would just jump into Tears first. But maybe people who jumped in with Tears and are going backwards? Or do they still feel the need to beat Breath of the Wild before they even play Tears of the Kingdom? Obviously, Tears wasn't going to immediately outsell Breath of the Wild. It had a 6-year head start, was pretty much a cultural phenomenon in the gaming sphere, and Tears just being a straight sequel might have turned some people off. But if every Zelda from here on out sells 20 million copies, I don't think Nintendo will be too stressed. There are some franchises where one game will always be the best-selling title. Do you know the best-selling Pokemon game? It's Red and Blue. Yes, Pokemon has never topped those first games in terms of sales. But I think I'd still consider the Pokemon franchise to be a fairly successful one, even though it's never topped the sales of those original games. But I do imagine this is going to be a trend with the Switch 2 era. I don't see Mario Kart 9 outselling 8, or the next Animal Crossing outselling New Horizons. So get ready for a lot of discourse around that for the next, maybe decade or so. But you know what game will sell 20 million copies? Nintendo World Championships NES Edition, coming July 18th. It has the subtitle Famicom Sekai Taikai, or Famicom World Tournament in Japan. This is in the vein of the NES Remix games, where there are several fixed challenges for classic NES games. Honestly, the game didn't put me on the edge of my seat. It's there for those who are into speedrunning and score challenges, though. I still might pick it up, but I don't know. I think an even crazier NES remix, or if it had SNES and N64 games or something, would be way more enticing. This is called NES Edition, so is SNES Edition coming? DS Edition? Virtual Boy Edition? Nintendo hasn't announced the dev, but someone at Indie Zero did retweet the announcement, so I assume that they are handling it like they did NES Remix. Also, going back to Zelda for a bit, we got some big announcements, including the Tears of the Kingdom Masterworks book is coming August 30th in Japan. This is the big art book for the game similar to the ones we've seen in the past for Zelda. They showed off some promo pages, including a lot of art with Rauru and Sonia, plus concept hairstyles for Zelda. These are always fun to flip through, so hardcore Zelda fans might want to make an effort to check it out. Also, the OST, which includes 9 CDs and 344 songs, will hit on July 31st. It will come with a cool Master Sword pedestal USB drive. The box set looks fantastic, and will set you back 19,800 yen, which I think is about $4 thanks to the yen depreciation. But maybe you should save your money since Bandai has announced that they will put out a replica Master Sword for 22,000 yen. This is as life-sized as can be, 105 centimeters long, and you can press a button to make it play some sound effects. Pre-orders are available now with a release in September. I'm not going to buy this thing, but I do want to hold it. NSO is also back, this time with new Game Boy titles, Super Mario Land, Alleyway, Baseball, and in Japan, The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls. Those first 3 games were launch games, so it makes sense for them to finally return for the Game Boy's 35th anniversary this year. But the Japan exclusive game is one I've already talked about on the podcast, though I erroneously called it For the Frog the Bell Tolls, which was a popular English translation, but according to Smash, the name is The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls, so we gotta go with that. Go back and listen to that episode if you want my in-depth thoughts. Just go down in your podcast app or search for Frog on tokyogamelife.com. I tried out a bit of Super Mario Land, which is not an amazing game, but it is impressive that 4 years after Super Mario Bros., there is a portable Mario platformer. And of course, it's got great music. Another Nintendo announcement, X, aka Twitter, will no longer be connected to your Nintendo Switch as of June 11th. This means you will not be able to directly post images through the Switch onto Twitter, and also the Splatoon 3 graffiti you make won't automatically go to Twitter either. Nintendo is the last across the finish line when it comes to removing X integration, as Sony and Microsoft removed it a while ago. I'm honestly surprised Nintendo held out that long, but Twitter is extremely popular in Japan, and it's more integrated into specific games like Splatoon 3, so maybe it took more time to transition. If you're wondering why all the major platform owners are removing X integration, well, they are now charging tens of thousands of dollars per month for API access, so why pay it? You can still post images and videos to your games to social media, including Twitter, if you send them to your smartphone via a QR code you can scan. A bit cumbersome, but I've always done this, since I prefer typing messages on my phone than on the Switch. Last bit of news, Dragon Quest and Graniph have a new collab. This is actually their 5th collab, and they've introduced over a dozen new items. Perhaps the standout for me is the Slime button-up shirt and the Slime Knight socks. Graniph is a great Japanese clothing brand if you're into t-shirts, so definitely check out their online store. Whew, that's a lot of news. And that'll be all for the episode. Thanks as always for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app. Leave a 5-star review as well, it really helps with visibility. This podcast is also available on YouTube, so like and subscribe there as well. I'm on Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram. Just search for Tokyo Game Life or find the links in the podcast description. If you like the podcast, be sure to share with your friends and on social media. If there's anything we want to talk about or cover, don't be shy. Just message me on Twitter. The next episode will be on June 2nd. See you next time. Matane!